Palace of Westminster in the early 19th century, a curious combination of the grand and the ramshackle. A royal palace for centuries, it was here that MPs and peers met to debate the business of the kingdom. And it was to Westminster that a young reporter named Charles Dickens came to earn his living in the early 1830s.
5 or so years that Dickens was actually working as a parliamentary reporter were actually some of the most dramatic, really, in British political history.
He found politicians pompous. He thought they made promises which they weren't keeping. He kind of wasn't impressed with the rhetoric. He obviously found it boring.
I don't think Dickens minded much about making a bit of fun of the electoral process as well.
Night after night I record predictions that never come to pass, professions that are never fulfilled, explanations that are only meant to mystify.
The Westminster reporter of today works from here in the press gallery in the House of Commons. Now, on a busy day like Prime Minister's Question Time, the chamber seats are packed out. So are these reporter seats. We have desks and benches, as you see, all allocated places and quite favourable conditions to work in. Very different from Dickens' day, in fact. He didn't even work here. This wasn't here. He worked in the old Palace of Westminster.
Today, when people think of Parliament, they think of the iconic building of Barry and Pugin, which is famous the world over. And it's so famous that it's obliterated our memories of what was there before. But that palace, the old palace, had been there for 800 years. It was the palace where the gunpowder plot was plotted. It's the palace where all the debates around the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the Great Reform Act took place. And of course, that's the palace that Dickens would have known, where he started his career.
Dickens would have been working near here. This is Westminster Hall, the oldest building in Parliament, dating from medieval times. Over the centuries, it's housed law courts, even shops, and today it's used for ceremonial occasions. It's also one of the few parts of the Palace of Westminster that survived the Great Fire that swept through here in 1834. Not that the whole palace back then looked like this, far from it.
Originally, there was a fairly logical plan to the medieval buildings, but over the centuries, various apartments had grown up, the floor levels had changed, various bars and taverns had been attached to the sides of the buildings and then taken away again. Office space was having to be carved out as the parliamentary administration grew, and there was no overall plan for it, so it had become this incredibly ramshackle, wandering place full of corridors and stairs and doorways leading to who knows where.
It was all rather symbolic of society itself. This was still the era of the rotten boroughs, constituencies with tiny electorates, often in the pocket of a wealthy patron, while big industrial centres like Manchester had no MPs. Dickens was in Parliament when the Great Reform Act of 1832, designed to tackle such abuses of the electoral system, came into law. Dickens was still a young man when he arrived here at Westminster sometime in the session of 1830 to 1831, and he certainly would have stood out from his peers. Many of the reporters were university graduates, but young Charles had received a patchy schooling. At the age of 12, he'd had to work in a factory in central London when his father was in prison for debt. By the time he reached his late teens, he used family connections to get a job in journalism. So we've come to the basement of the History of Parliament building in London, and there are some valued possessions here. Dr. Philip Salmon, talk me through what this one in particular is. It is called Mirror of Parliament.
Yeah, well, these are some of the volumes that we know that Dickens definitely worked on during his time as a reporter at the Mirror of Parliament.
I just took it off the shelf. Was that all right? I mean, it's all, it looks quite delicate, really.
And obviously it's not clear exactly which bits he contributed to, but it's absolutely clear that about a 12th of this would have been written by him.
And it looks, probably, if people are familiar with Hansard, It's very similar to that. It was a rival publication to Hansard, wasn't it?
It was a rival publication set up by Dickens' uncle, actually, in 1828. It's actually a much better publication in this earlier period, much fuller accounts of the debates taking part. Whether or not that's due to Dickens, I don't know. The 5 or so years that Dickens was actually working as a parliamentary reporter were actually some of the most dramatic, really, in British political history. In 1829, you had Catholic emancipation, hugely controversial measure giving Catholics the right to sit in Parliament. And the next few years are then dominated by a huge struggle over parliamentary reform, the Great Reform Bill, which completely gripped the nation and actually brought Britain very close to revolution. In 1834, there's the New Poor Law, which a very controversial measure which introduces the notorious Victorian workhouse system for the poor, with its separation of children and parents and husbands and wives. And the following year there's the introduction of elected town councils, another major step on the road to democracy. So in many ways it's a hugely important and exciting time to be working as a parliamentary reporter.
And this was a great era for covering events at Westminster.
Verbatim accounts of what MPs had said the previous day actually appeared on the front pages of all the leading daily newspapers of the period. And they're also published separately by commercial organisations like Hansard and then sold for a profit. And that's something that would be inconceivable today.
How many people would you think would have read those reports?
We estimate that about 2 million people were reading parliamentary debates on a regular basis, making it sort of one of the mass entertainments of the time, really.
But while the reporting was popular with the public, Dickens and the other reporters found it harder to impress the Westminster authorities. Reporting proceedings was against the rules, and only a few decades beforehand, journalists who dared to do so had been jailed. By the early 19th century, reporters had been allocated space in the old Commons, but they had to share the public gallery.
The journalists were effectively admitted to Parliament on sufferance, and there was still a procedure that allowed the MPs to clear the public gallery and get all the journalists out and enable MPs to debate in private, which happened quite a lot.
The old House of Commons was actually situated up these stairs and to the left in the Royal Chapel of St Stephen. Today, it's the location of a fairly broad hallway, but in the early 19th century, during Dickens' time here, this was a rather poky debating chamber. Images of the time make it look larger than it really was.
At the very most, it could accommodate about 400 of the 658 MPs who actually were elected at this time, and that would be with them all squeezed around the edges and right up at the bar. So it was very cramped, very claustrophobic. And one of the other major complaints was that it was very gloomy and very dim, very difficult to actually see. And a major source of complaint as well during this time was that the air quality in the Commons could be absolutely appalling. The gas lighting, very primitive, all the candles, the open fires, created this sort of fog, particularly during long night sittings. In fact, I think many of the night sittings would have been conducted in a complete fog of carbon monoxide.
There are numerous references in Dickens's fiction to people with inky hands, and he had first-hand experience of what that was like. And a shorthand reporter couldn't last longer than 3/4 of an hour. That was the length of a shift, but one might end up working as many as 3 shifts a night, and one was paid a guinea a throw. And then they would then come out and retire to somewhere close at hand, we're not entirely sure where, to write out their notes in longhand, and there would be runners waiting for those notes to rush off with them to the compositors, who would get ready to set the thing up in hot metal.
Many of the sittings occurred at night. They dragged on until the small hours of the morning. So it wouldn't be unusual to be reporting on debates taking place at 2, 3 or even 4 o'clock in the morning.
In a speech many years later to the Newspaper Press Fund, Charles Dickens recalled those times.
I have worn my knees by writing on them, on the old back row of the old gallery of the House of Commons, and I've worn my feet by standing to write in a preposterous pen in the old House of Lords, where we used to be huddled together like so many sheep.
But the reporters were witnesses to history, as the man who advises the Speaker and takes charge of the day-to-day running of the modern House of Commons explains.
One thing that I picked out was the record in the Mirror of Parliament of the 22nd of March 1831. We have risked place, power and distinction, in short, everything, in an endeavour, I hope it may prove a successful one, to improve largely, liberally and generously the constitution of the country. And there was that relatively small chamber, 600 members in there, and a few minutes later the second reading was decided on division. The ayes were 302 and the noes were 301, and the majority was 1. And what a moment that must have been, and perhaps Dickens was there, and those were some of the words that Dickens himself recorded.
Despite the conditions, Dickens' writing career went from strength to strength. After the Mirror of Parliament, there was a stint on a radical paper, The True Sun. Then, in 1834, he gained a staff job on one of the leading papers of the day, the Morning Chronicle. It was later that year that Parliament found itself thrust into one of the biggest stories of the era. On the night of October the 16th, 1834, fire broke out in the basement of the House of Lords and quickly took hold. Staff panicked and delayed raising the alarm.
The actual layout of the palace itself helped the fire to move through really quickly because of these wandering corridors with no fire breaks, no fire doors like we have today. And once it was outside the building, shooting through the roof, the wind was very brisk on that October night, and it blew it southwesterly right across the House of Commons. And so it was in the core of the palace and just burnt it away overnight.
Among the crowds were teams of reporters filing vivid accounts of the blaze. Who wrote what? We don't know, as bylines weren't used at the time.
The scene at the time was grand and terrific. The flames shot up at a great height and obscured the light of the moon, increasing rather than diminishing the apparent darkness of the night, and contrasting in a striking manner the brilliant light which they threw upon the surrounding objects with the apparent blackness of the sky.
I think it's unaccountable that Dickens wouldn't have been amongst the crowds in the fire. He was a parliamentary reporter, obviously. This is the place where he was getting his money from. We know that he was in London on the days around the fire, but unfortunately there's no correspondence left surviving from the day of the fire or the day after the fire, which absolutely proves that he was there. It's clear that fire plays an enormously important part in the denouement of various novels, for example, Great Expectations, Bleak House, and I think personally there's a passage in Oliver Twist, which was written only a couple of years after the fire of 1834, which sounds very much like the fire at Westminster.
This is a very interesting question, and it's one that would be susceptible to more research. He had been taken on by the Morning Chronicle in August 1834, and the fire at the old Houses of Parliament broke out in October. So he was on the books, and it's perfectly possible that the Morning Chronicle's descriptions of the fire, or at least part of them, could be from Dickens's pen. It's much easier to spot him in action, though, when he's writing what he called his sketches of London and his street sketches, because he comes to sign those with a little moniker which has gone down in history, the three letters B-O-Z, Boz.
Although much of Parliament was destroyed in the fire of 1834, many of the records survived because they were kept on a site away from here. But they're now stored here in the Parliamentary Archives in Victoria Tower. It's a treasure trove of parchment scrolls dating back hundreds of years. Among the pieces of legislation here are acts that Dickens himself would have reported on. The 1832 Great Reform Act, for example, and the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. And here we have some of the very acts upon which Dickens himself reported. They're kept on parchment scrolls. These two acts here, this is the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, and here we have the 1832 Great Reform Act. You can see 1832 written on the parchment here. Now, they're incredibly delicate. Obviously, they're nearly 200 years old, so I can't touch it, but I have an expert here who will unroll it for us. So let's just take a look at the Great Reform Act, which of course caused a huge stir among the population and kept MPs busy, extremely busy, in the House of Commons. We can see here the wording transcribed onto these parchment scrolls. Here's the bill as it was first written, but interestingly, just inside here is an amendment which has been stitched into the bill, different writing as you can see, and on here are the details of the abolition of the rotten boroughs. By now, Dickens had become a star writer. He was sent to political speeches in Edinburgh and Exeter and reported on a by-election in Kettering, which may well have proved inspirational.
Hurrah! Shouted the mob in conclusion. One cheer more, screamed the little fugleman in the balcony. Out shouted the mob again. Slumkey forever, roared the honest and independent, and Mr. Pickwick starts to take part in this. Slumkey forever, echoed Mr. Pickwick, taking off his hat. No Fizkin, roared the crowd. Certainly not, shouted Mr. Pickwick. Hurrah! And then there was another roaring, like that of a whole menagerie when the elephant has rung the bell for the cold meat. And Mr. Tupman, rather daring, says, Who is Slumkey? I don't know, says Mr. Pickwick. Hush, don't ask any questions. Always best on these occasions to do what the mob does. But suppose there are two mobs, suggested Mr. Snodgrass. Shout with the loudest, replied Mr. Pickwick. So I think the fine points of electoral manifestos may actually have been rather missed out on this occasion, but I don't think Dickens minded much about making a bit of fun of the electoral process as well.
He was also developing his literary style. Years later, Dickens was to recall, somewhat romantically perhaps, trembling with fear when he dropped off a short story on spec to a magazine in Fleet Street. When the story was published, Dickens described how he had to take a walk here in Westminster Hall for half an hour because, he said, his eyes were so dimmed with joy and pride that they could not bear the street. And when Parliament wasn't sitting, newspapers had plenty of column inches to fill.
And it's into that space, arguably, that Dickens first steps as a creative writer. He, by 1834, has got onto the permanent staff of another radical London paper called the Morning Chronicle, broadly described as a Whig paper. And its editor, John Black, reckons that Dickens has got talent, and Dickens shows him some of his creative writing, his sketch writing, and he is quite quickly, after being taken on, allowed to fill some of those empty spaces with his first attempts at creative writing, which are pure reporter's observation of the streets of London.
Dickens' relationship with the city is celebrated in a bicentenary exhibition at the Museum of London, which runs until June.
London was already the world's largest city. We're talking about a population of maybe creeping towards about 2 million. But in European terms, this is a monster city. It's an incredibly big place. And I think Dickens got really excited about the movement and life of the city. And very soon he was writing these essays about the city, describing all sorts of details that really other authors hadn't really looked at before. In those early writings we find him addressing really some of the very poor areas of London. And I think that's really what took the sort of late Regency public by storm, really. These were very exciting new texts that were being written by him.
In 1836, his Sketches by Boz were published in book form. By then, Dickens had another serialisation underway, the Pickwick Papers. Its success enabled him to quit his job at the Chronicle, and the rest is literary history. The bicentenary of Dickens' birth was marked in early February at Westminster Abbey, in the presence of their Royal Highnesses, the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. The celebration of his life and work brought together the largest gathering of descendants. Cabinet ministers were given their own copies of Dickens' novels to remember the occasion. But some MPs need no prompting to read Dickens.
I think there's something wonderfully descriptive about the language that Dickens uses. I think his novels are incredibly well written, incredibly well thought through, and I used to read them when I was in Afghanistan because they provided the perfect opportunity to have a moment to be somewhere else. There's this wonderful Dickens quote, best of times, worst of times, and that's precisely how it was in Afghanistan. Best of times because I was part of a small knit team working incredibly hard doing something that we believed in. Worst of times because it was a very difficult situation in Afghanistan, the level of threat was very high. So that wonderful quote, best of times, worst of times, very neatly encapsulates my experiences of serving in Afghanistan.
What about those running the present-day House of Commons? What do they make of Westminster as represented by Dickens?
He was not particularly keen on Parliament as an institution, because some of his barbs about Parliament are really reserved for the institution. But some of the individuals, I think, who were carrying forward what he saw as being necessary social reforms, I think that was a rather different thing. And the individuals he valued, but the institution, I think, I suspect, rather less.
So is it possible to know what influence Westminster had on the young writer?
Those 5 or 6 years were absolutely crucial. They were formative. And I suppose the best way of answering this is to use a kind of spatial idea, because there he is in the gallery of the House of Commons. It gives him an angle on public events. He's not on the inside, he's not in the establishment, but to an extent he's looking down on all of this that's going on at the heart of the British Parliament, which he often likens to the theatre or a circus or a bear garden. And he has that perspective. I don't think other writers of the period who didn't have that particular angle could get the same tone, that sort of arch tone, partly facetious, partly knowing, partly on the inside, but still on the margins.
There was a lovely thing here about a particular sort of member who can tell you long stories of Fox, Pitt, Sheridan and Canning, and how much better the House was managed in those times. And when they used to get up at 8 or 9 o'clock, except on regular field days, he has a great contempt for all young members of Parliament and thinks it quite impossible that a man can say anything worth hearing unless he's sat in the House for 15 years at least without saying anything at all. Now, I don't think that is an easy one to map on the modern House of Commons, but it does show that Dickens has got this immensely sharp eye for some of the characters and the way they behaved.
His years as a Westminster reporter may have furnished Charles Dickens with many a tale and character for his subsequent novels, but by all accounts, he was not impressed by the place at all.
He found politicians pompous. He thought they made promises which they weren't keeping. He kind of wasn't impressed with the rhetoric. He obviously found it boring, because once he left the place, he effectively didn't come back. He's quite scathing in what he writes about politics.
When he was later invited to become an MP, he declined.
He was wooed by the constituents of various parliamentary constituencies, and he wrote long and thoughtful responses explaining that he had thought about it seriously. But I think by this stage we're talking about the second half of the 1840s and then again in the 1850s. He realised he could wield a much more direct, if not more glamorous kind of power. by using his position as a leading writer of fiction and a magazine editor.
Perhaps we should leave the last word to the author himself from his autobiographical novel, David Copperfield.
I have tamed that savage stenographic mystery. I make a respectable income by it. I am in high repute for my accomplishment in all pertaining to the art, and am joined with 11 others in reporting the debates in Parliament for a morning newspaper. Night after night I record predictions that never come to pass, professions that are never fulfilled, explanations that are only meant to mystify. I wallow in words. I am sufficiently behind the scenes to know the worth of political life. I'm quite an infidel about it, and shall never be converted.